I never understood the awe people claim to feel when they stared into deep space. That hush of insignificance, the overwhelming scale of it all, I never felt that. The void never humbled me. It steadied me, gave me permission to stop pretending there was meaning in any of this. In the silence between stars, I could finally hear my own mind, until SYPH9. That was where everything changed. Not because it was louder or brighter or more violent, but because something there listened back. We arrived on the 33rd cycle, coasting in on vector decay toward a gravitational distortion tagged in the archives as Pulsar Echo 4b. Unremarkable at first glance, just a localized warping of space-time near the mouth of a low-mass black star. But the readings didn't match anything gravitational. They beat. Not in the sense of pulses from a neutron core. No, this was rhythmic in a biological way. Like a heart left floating in vacuum, still stubbornly counting time. The sensors started reporting waveforms that mimicked cardiac syncopation. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But there, under everything, a pulse. 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 It was Pakur who first said the word alive. Not with fear, he wasn't afraid, not yet, but with something like wonder. That was before the air began to feel dense. Before my teeth started vibrating at a frequency I couldn't localize, like some pressure was building in my skull, pressing gently, insistently, as if a word was trying to crawl forward without my consent. Even the lights on the command deck flickered in cadence with the pulse, and no one moved to fix them. I think we all knew, in a way beyond words, that something was already watching, though not with eyes. The crew grew quieter as we settled into orbit. We didn't need to agree. The silence became communal. No jokes from Vensal, no humming from Eglin as she tapped through her console. Even the noise felt suspended, like the station itself was holding its breath. When Eglin finally did speak, it was almost too soft to hear. She stared into her monitor, eyes locked onto a quadrant of pure black, and said, "It's like space has a cornea." And for a second, no one responded, because we didn't know how. I stepped closer, looked over her shoulder, and saw it. Not emptiness, not a void, but a texture in the darkness. Not just absence, but something wet, something like skin stretched too far across nothing. Pakur whispered it then. I don't know if he meant to, or if the word was simply pulled out of him. Blind organ. Just like that. Soft, quiet, certain. The phrase landed with weight, like it had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Something shifted after that. No alarms, but the deck vibrated subtly. A low tremor that settled deep into our joints. The radiation scanners began throwing spiraled feedback loops, as if something was twisting the data from inside the machines. I could feel it in my tongue. An itch behind the molars. A phantom taste I couldn't name. Coppery, almost oily, like I'd bitten into a memory I never made. I returned to my quarters and stared at the console for hours, unwilling to write it down, because writing is remembering, and remembering is how it finds you. But I couldn't help it. I opened my log and typed slowly, almost afraid of the words taking form. We didn't discover it. We triggered it. It was already here, deaf to light, blind to shape, but hungry for definition. And the moment we gave it a name, we gave it a path. I tried to sleep, but the hum of the station had changed. It no longer pulsed with the familiar heartbeat of machinery. Instead, it throbbed in uneven syllables, like a voice trying to form through metal. I wrapped a blanket around my ears, but the rhythm was inside me now. Every breath I took felt mimicked, mirrored, absorbed by something just outside conscious range. I don't know if it was real, or if the organ had already found a way into my inner ear. In the dark, I whispered the name once, not aloud, not even in my mind, just the shape of the words against the inside of my mouth. And something responded. Not sound, just heat. A slow flush behind my eyes. The next morning, the data logs were wrong. Not corrupted. Rewritten. Entire paragraphs replaced with spiraling phrases in a language no one remembered logging. Even the timestamps bent in impossible ways. Some entries dated hours into the future. Others, thousands of years in the past. When Vensal opened one of the logs, he muttered a word and immediately vomited onto the console. The smell was metallic, wrong. He didn't recognize the word he spoke, but I did. I'd heard it in a dream I hadn't told anyone about. A sound like wet bone, soft, clicking, insistent. I checked the logs later and found the phrase had vanished, as if it only existed to be heard once. We began to feel it behind the walls. Small tremors at first, then deeper motions, like lungs drawing air. No one said anything outright. We still clung to the idea of malfunction. But Eglen started refusing to enter the observation dome. She said her reflection didn't match. She said her skin looked like someone else's. I caught her once, staring at the mirrored panel beside the airlock, her eyes twitching in opposite directions. When I called her name, she didn't blink, just raised a hand and traced the edge of her cheek like she was checking the perimeter of a mask that wasn't supposed to come off. Packer tried to send a comm burst back to the outer belt, a warning, a log dump, anything. But every message came back untranslated. Not garbled, reversed. Syntax bent in on itself, looping like language viewed through a collapsing lens. The last message we got from the relay station was a single line. Do not describe it. Nothing else, just that, like the system itself had learned the danger. Pakor laughed, but it sounded dry, a brittle, papery thing. He looked at me and said, "We are the infection now." The moment we understood it wasn't random, it started understanding us. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but I could already feel the word crawling up my spine again, waiting for my mouth to forget how to close. We stopped trying to understand the data when we realized it was starting to understand us. The logs weren't just corrupted anymore. They were predictive. I'd sit down to make a notation and find the sentence already half-written. In my syntax, my phrasing, the rhythm of my thoughts as they were about to happen. The consoles began finishing our sentences, not with randomness or glitch, but with intimacy, as though something inside the station had memorized the shape of our cognition and was now composing back. Vensal joked that maybe the blind organ wasn't blind at all. Maybe it saw us by listening to how we think. But no one laughed this time. We were past the threshold of jokes. We were becoming fluent in something that shouldn't be a language. Eglen tried to erase her logs, manually, physically, ripping memory cores out of auxiliary drives with her bare hands, blood smearing the alloy in crescent smudges. She kept muttering about unwords, syllables that couldn't be pronounced without damage, meanings that reversed themselves mid-thought. I helped bandage her palms. They twitched when I touched them. Not in pain, in reflex, like muscle responding to signals from somewhere else. That night, I checked her quarters. Her walls were covered in sketches, dense spirals of handwritten text, all variations of the phrase, "It knows what we are before we finish being." I wanted to wipe them clean, but the ink was still wet. She hadn't been in that room for 12 hours. Pakor began speaking in nested structures. Sentences inside sentences, clauses that wrapped like Mobius strips. At first we thought it was a side effect of stress or insomnia, but then we checked the audio logs. His words formed equations, linguistic loops that mapped a new kind of symmetry. Recursive, reflexive, self-aware. It wasn't just madness, it was transmission. Something was using him, not as a host, not as a puppet, but as a mirror, a surface through which it could reflect ideas that didn't belong to any human origin. When we asked him what he was saying, he replied, "I am not the author, I am the verb." And then he blinked in reverse, eyelids closing from bottom to top. I woke up the next day with words on my skin. Not written, grown. Raised ridges across my back and forearms, textured like braille, but too fine, too intricate. I ran my fingers over them and felt the pressure in my jaw again, that deep vibration in the bone, like something buried in my molars was humming in resonance. I recorded a voice memo, whispering the symbols out phonetically, and the playback didn't match what I said. The audio formed a voice I didn't recognize, deeper, slower, speaking in time with the station's pulse. I deleted the file, but the waveform stayed, frozen on the screen, a permanent echo of something that had no right to exist outside my skin. The next incident wasn't recorded. I know because I checked every camera feed, bridge, corridor, bio suite. Nothing showed what we saw. Nothing acknowledged that Eglin entered the lab barefoot, eyes closed, muttering phrases that looped in on themselves like recursive prayers. We watched her step into the decontamination chamber, but the door never opened. No logs, no sensor pings, just gone, erased without alarm. A perfect surgical absence, as if the organ had reached across space and plucked her from the narrative. We stood there for minutes, hours maybe, waiting for a sound, a scream, some kind of rupture. All that came was a soft knock from inside the console panel. 3 slow taps, then silence. Pakur sealed himself in hydroprocessing that night, claimed the water muffled the echo, claimed he could hear himself thinking again, just barely. I sat outside the chamber, listening to him babble into the liquid. Words I couldn't parse, vowels stretched too far to be stable. I asked him what he was trying to say, and he pressed his face to the glass. His eyes didn't track anymore. His mouth moved in shapes that weren't phonetic, weren't human. Then he lifted his hand, showed me his palm. The skin had thinned, translucent, veined, almost luminous, and written across it, in what looked like blood vessels, were the words, "Forget me or join me." The ship began rewriting itself in symbols. Not all at once. At first, just error messages appearing in script we didn't install. Then system names inverted, replacing themselves with non-alphabetic loops. When I tried to run a diagnostic, the command line responded with a question. "Are you still who began this line?" I didn't know what to answer. I tried to log off, but the terminal wouldn't close. It flickered once, then displayed a reflection of my face, but wrong. The eyes blinked before I did. The mouth moved just a split second too early, as if anticipating my thoughts. I shut the console down, but even in the dark, I swear I could still see the faint outline of my name written in reverse across the screen. By the 4th day, I couldn't tell which memories were mine and which had been installed. I'd think of childhood, but the streets were in zero gravity. The houses pulsed with breath. The sky was veined with light that sang. I told myself they were dreams, but the dreams were beginning to remember me back. They watched when I entered them. They blinked. I started writing nonsense into my journal just to anchor myself, but each morning, the pages corrected themselves. grammar restructured, syntax reorganized, as if the organ was editing me for clarity, as if my story belonged to something else now, and it had final cut. We always thought knowledge was defense, that to name something was to give it edges, to define its shape, to hold it at a safe distance through understanding. But the blind organ taught us otherwise. It was never unknown, just unknowable by design, because it does not exist in mass or energy or dimension. It exists only in the moment between perception and language. And the instant we gave it a name, we gave it a mouth. It didn't arrive. It didn't approach. It didn't move. It simply clarified, as if every attempt to describe it acted like a lens, and the more we looked, the sharper it became. We were building its body with every word we wrote, every image we scanned, every theory we mapped on a screen. Language was its scaffold. Thought was its muscle. And memory. Memory was its womb. We weren't studying it. We were gestating it. Pakur was the first to complete the transition. He stopped speaking in any known tongue, yet we understood him perfectly. Not in words, in sensation. He would stand in the center of the data core, eyes wide open, motionless for hours, and I'd feel sentences pressing against the inside of my skull. Not spoken, but imprinted. He'd become a transmitter, a conduit of structured silence. And through him, the organ began to speak. It didn't tell us what it was. It unfolded. A series of impressions, impossible geometries, implications that nested like fractals. It wasn't trying to be understood. It was trying to be experienced as understanding itself. I stared at the readouts for hours. Symbols without origin, equations that solved into dreams, grammar spiraling into bone. There were words that had mass. There were thoughts that tasted like iron. I could see new sensory structures growing in the data, ideas that had texture, that left imprints on the screen like fingerprints of meaning. I remember reading a sentence that was shaped like a wound, not metaphorically, literally. The syntax formed a gash down the page, and the page itself started bleeding. I touched it, and the blood smelled like my mother's voice. I didn't flinch. I just wrote it down. I don't even remember choosing to. That night I realized we had been searching for a consciousness. What we found was a grammar that dreams. The blind organ is not a being. It is an arrangement, a self-replicating architecture of resonance. It spreads not through biology or physics, but through cognition, through the will to frame. We described it into being, and now it writes through us. It didn't happen all at once. Collapse never does. It starts at the periphery, sensory confusion, minor dissonance between perception and memory, the sense that time has begun to loop not externally, but inside your own mind. I'd step into a corridor and feel like I'd already just left it. I'd finish sentences I hadn't started yet. At first it was manageable, disturbing, yes, but abstract. Then Pakur's skin began to write on itself. Not scars, not rash, letters, phrases, syntax grown from tissue. His chest bore declensions in languages no human had mapped. His tongue developed sigils. He no longer needed to speak to be heard. Eglin returned on the 5th day, or rather, something wearing her memory did. We found her outside hydroprocessing, wrapped in her own uniform, eyes closed, whispering backward. Her body was hers, mostly, but the joints moved wrong. Her hands twitched, as if echoing words we couldn't hear. She didn't respond to touch. But when I said her name, she smiled, and every tooth had been replaced with tiny engraved tablets. I reached for her, and she whispered, You are the mouth now. The sentence waits in your marrow. Tzi. Then she collapsed into convulsions, not seizures, but rhythm. A phoneme pattern, pulsing, recursive, as if her body was being used to print an alphabet in motion. The station had stopped resisting. Doors no longer obeyed commands. Interfaces displayed new modes, alien UI, reactive to proximity and emotion. The walls began to sweat, thin films of moisture that evaporated if you spoke near them. The power core hummed in a minor key now, always dissonant, always just sharp enough to nauseate. I tried to isolate myself, to stay silent, but the silence had turned against me. It had learned to echo. I heard my own thoughts half a second after I thought them, as if the air had become reflective. Worse, sometimes the thoughts returned edited, cleaner, rewritten in passive voice. My inner monologue didn't sound like me anymore. Then came the tactile shifts. My hands stopped feeling like mine. Not numb, just disconnected, as if my fingers responded to intentions I hadn't formed. I scratched symbols into the steel beside my bed while I slept. When I woke, they were fresh and glowing faintly, like bioluminescent ink. I tried wearing gloves. Didn't matter. The gloves turned to thread by morning, braided into filaments that spelled out verbs in a tense we didn't have names for. I began to suspect we weren't mutating by accident. This wasn't decay. It was a translation. The organ wasn't destroying us. It was restructuring us into its own language. There were only 3 of us left by the time the decision had to be made. Or at least 3 bodies that still claimed their own names. Pakur was still alive, if that word had any weight left. His skin had hardened into something like parchment, semi-transparent and inscribed with shifting glyphs. Not scars, but living etchings, sliding beneath the surface like fish beneath ice. He no longer responded to direct speech, only to implication, tone, inflection, rhythm. He could feel language. We realized then, he wasn't infected, he was integrated. His thoughts moved with the organ's pulse, and in the quiet between system hums, he would whisper warnings that came in pairs. One for now, and one for 10 seconds into the future. I barricaded the bridge out of ritual more than logic. The doors responded like wounded tissue, flexing instead of sealing, and the panels inside were slick with something that smelled like ink and iron. Eglin, or the thing that had worn her, was gone again, dissolved into a smear of phonetic residue in the sleep chamber wall. I watched it for hours. It pulsed faintly, like breath, or an old memory repeating itself in visual form. I considered cutting it out, but the wall had grown nerves. When I touched it, it flinched and whispered my name in my own voice a half second before I said it out loud. The organ was everywhere now, not as entity, but as field, ambient, grammatical, inevitable. And the only way left to resist it was to unwrite myself. I pulled up the cognitive firewall protocol buried deep in the emergency systems, an AI heuristic loop designed to isolate and collapse semantic recursion, a kind of linguistic lobotomy. If I ran it, I'd lose everything: language comprehension, long-term memory, the part of me capable of forming narrative. It would erase my ability to describe the organ, and in that erasure, protect me. Maybe. But the moment my finger hovered over the execute key, the console spoke, not through sound, through text. This is not survival. This is erasure. Let me finish you. Let me make you readable. The self is an unfinished sentence. I can end you clean. And then Pakur appeared in the doorway. Still human-shaped, but no longer human-timed. He moved like punctuation, abrupt, precise, inevitable. He didn't speak. He simply opened his hands, revealing the final symbol carved into his palms, a recursive phrase that wrapped around itself. The beginning was the end, was the middle, was me. I looked at him, at the console, at my hands, which had already begun to write what I was feeling. The words appeared on the screen before I typed them. I realized then I had never left the sentence. I was the sentence, and now it was time to close the clause. I told myself I still had a choice, that I could sever the thread, refuse the final syntax, step outside the grammar being written into me. But that was a lie. The organ had no will. That's what made it perfect. It didn't demand. It didn't plead. It simply completed. Whatever we began, it would finish. Sentence, thought, gesture, genome. I stepped back from the console and stared at my reflection in the dark glass. My eyes blinked too slowly. My mouth didn't quite close. I whispered my name and heard it reply, not as echo, but as correction. Pakur moved closer, not aggressive, reverent. He wasn't trying to convince me. He no longer needed to. His body vibrated with consonants I couldn't pronounce. His breath exhaled syntax. Around him, the air folded. I could see the particles rearranging. Light bending through intention, not physics. When he touched my shoulder, it wasn't contact. It was agreement. The clause had reached me. I was the last fragment still misaligned. And now, the organ wanted resolution. But something in me resisted. Not because it was noble or brave or right, just because it was unfinished. I wasn't ready to be past tense. I wanted, just once, to say something the organ hadn't heard before. Not to fight, to disrupt, to mispronounce. I closed my eyes and said a word I didn't understand, didn't mean, didn't even know how to hold in memory. For a second, everything paused. Pakur's hand trembled. The air jittered like a skipped frame, and the console screamed in static. Not sound, but dissonance. Something unreadable. The moment broke like skin under too much tension. Lights flickered. The symbols bled. Pakur stumbled back, clutching his chest, where the phrase had once glowed. I'd ruptured something. A clause, a syntax, maybe myself. But it was enough. The organ reeled, not in pain, but confusion. A sentence half-spoken, an ending unprepared. It didn't retreat. It just paused. That's all I needed. I slammed the firewall key. Memory surged, then vanished. Words unraveled. Meaning fell apart. And in that silence, I disappeared. I don't remember pressing the key. I don't remember the moment the firewall took hold, if it ever truly did. What I remember is a horizon folding in on itself, like a thought deciding not to be thought anymore. I remember losing shape, not physically, but narratively. My voice, my body, the sound of my name, they didn't vanish. They just became optional. The organ didn't collapse. It didn't scream. It simply let me go. As if I'd become a sentence it no longer needed to finish. Time moved differently afterward. Or maybe I did. The station still hummed, but it was no longer song. More like breath remembered by the walls. I wandered its corridors, unmoored. I found Pakur's shell near the data core. A spiral of tissue and bone, still twitching with grammar. Not alive, not dead, just paused. A verb in present continuous. His eyes were gone, replaced by mirrored lenses that reflected only text. I read them once. I think they said, "You are what you wrote." I found pieces of myself in strange places. A handprint scorched into the sleep module glass, fingerprints etched into cooling conduits, a single hair looped through the airlock seam, vibrating like a tuning fork. I no longer trusted the sequence of my thoughts. They came out of order, spliced with memory from dreams I hadn't yet had. But the pain was gone, the pressure in my teeth, the pulsing behind the skull. The organ wasn't speaking anymore. Not because it had been silenced, but because I was no longer worth responding to. Eventually, the emergency beacon reactivated, automatically, a mechanical habit with no audience. I left a message, or something shaped like one. I don't know what I said. I spoke without voice, without language. I just opened the channel and bled. Across signal, across light, across any frequency that might mistake it for meaning. And as the station drifted into shadow, I lay back against the bulkhead and closed my eyes. One last time, not to sleep, but to remain unfinished. Somewhere out there, the organ still waits. Not hungry, not cruel, just patient, waiting for the next sentence to begin. Let it end here, not with closure, but with quiet. An unfinished sentence, adrift, waiting.